So the 2022 F1 cars have now been launched, with the first 3-day pre-season test, or shakedown as F1 wanted to call it, taking place in Barcelona last week. And then following that, Alfa Romeo finally dropped their livery, having used a special camo one for that testing. Now, it's exciting to see the teams have their first go at creating designs that are specifically for their 2022 cars, which, given the regulation shake-up, isn't the easiest task. The shape of the bodywork has changed, changes to the front and rear wings also, and overall it's about as big as a livery reveal season as we've ever had. And given the excitement that livery season always brings, it's only fitting for me to put together a rankings as well. We do love to judge. Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and for my 2022 livery rankings. Before we get going, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy and subscribe for more F1 content. It really helps the channel out and is much appreciated. Now, let's get started. In 10th place, I've gone with Haas and the VF22. Regardless of if they still had the Uralkali sponsorship, it would still have been last in my rankings. And I think that's mainly because it's just too plain. Even with the original red and blue, there just wasn't much going on, and for me it was definitely worse than last year's car, which is disappointing as when a car doesn't have many sponsors, you'd hope they can do something more interesting with the colours and general design, but they just didn't. And you'll see with the Williams later on how a more simple design where you have less sponsorship can work if done right. Now with the Haas itself, I actually think it looks better with just the plain white than it did with the Uralkali branding. And because then the car has committed to a sort of basic as possible look, I guess that's how I'd phrase it, but even so, I just don't think I can look at the car and say it looks nice. It is just a plain white car with some stickers on it. Another little thing that they could have gotten right before losing Uralkali but didn't was the sizing of the numbers. Like, they just seem a bit too small and it just doesn't quite look right. But yeah, overall, regardless of the sponsorship, it was always last in my rankings. Just too basic of a livery for me. But now that Uralkali sponsorship is gone, and understandably so, it does give them the opportunity to come up with something before the season starts in Bahrain. Maybe back to something similar to the 2017-2018 cars, and if they did do that, I think it would be a move welcomed by the F1 world. In 9th place is the Alpine car, and after the livery they had last year, it's probably the one I'm most disappointed by. It sounds a little harsh, but last year's car looks so good, and coming into this year the expectation was higher, but for me as a livery it just doesn't do it. We all know that BWT coming across from Aston Martin, there would be some pink involved somehow, somewhere, and while I've got no problem with the pink on the car, I actually quite like that pink colour itself. I think the way it's been implemented into the design I'm just not really a fan of. Like, it seems a bit too much just a block of colour with the BWT logo stuck on it, rather than a more integrated design. I don't know if initially all the pink areas were red maybe, and then they just flipped them to pink, or if the design team are working with pink from an earlier stage. Either way, it's definitely more the design that doesn't work for me rather than just the colour scheme. I think it just seems a bit too crowded as well. Like, if you look at the back half of the car, like the airbox and the rear wing, just so much going on in a small space, and then the rear wing itself, as I mentioned earlier with that pink, just doesn't quite connect and integrate with the rest of the design. I think that's probably the best way I can put it. Overall, it's not terrible or anything, it's not a horrendous livery, and I think that because the overall standard of this year's cars is really high, that compared to the ones above it, the Alpine just doesn't look quite right for me. Like, there's a lot they could have done with that pink, and I get how the bit on the side follows the shape of the car, but it still just looks like a bit too much of a pink blob on the side. So in 8th place, we get to the liveries that really made me think. Like I say, the gap between 8 and 1, if I gave them a ranking, a number, is similar to the gap from 8 to 10, and in 8th I'm going to put the AlphaTauri. So this is their third car under the new team name and branding, and I think they've definitely settled into their style, but for me it doesn't quite have the same wow as some of the others that I've put above it. Like, it just doesn't quite click for me. While I like the colours generally, and the sort of proportions of the blue and the white seem good, there's a few things that just don't quite really work for me. Firstly, the slanted logo, I won't lie, it's got me tilting my head a little bit every time I see it. Not by a ridiculously huge amount, but enough that it's just a little annoying and not really my thing. Another part of it that I'm not really a fan of is that Flexbox logo on the front wing, more specifically the colours on the X. While I get that it's a company logo and there's nothing they can really do to change that, because it's the only bit of colour that's sort of different from the blue and the white, it really stands out kind of like a sore thumb. I do think, however, that the livery actually does a good job of covering the car. So what I mean by that is that even though there aren't loads of sponsors, as obviously the AlphaTauri brand is kind of the big advert for the team, the design does a good job with being interesting throughout. So compared to the Haas, for example, which doesn't have many sponsors, the placement of the base colours do a good job covering space on the car and the logo on the airbox as well. Hopefully that sort of makes sense what I'm saying. So yeah, overall I think it's a pretty solid design, but just has a number of things I don't really like or I don't think work fully. It's kind of where I've ranked it more so because of the ones above it being good rather than itself being bad. Next up in 7th place is Mercedes, and almost what I'd call the most frustrating livery, simply because the renders they released online as the official images and the car revealed in their launch stream and seen on the track in Barcelona are very different. Now, the render versions look incredible. They're aggressive and the silver used has a slight chrome to it which looks really good. And if the actual car did look more like the renders, without doubt I'd be placing it higher, personally probably towards my top 4 maybe. I really like that render they've released, but given how in general I think this year's set of liveries are very good and very closely matched, that step backwards between those renders and the actual car does cost it some spots in my rankings. And as the season goes on, I wouldn't be surprised if I end up with them possibly down a spot or 2 from here. Now, about the actual car and real life photos, I think it's nice to see the silver return. I was perfectly happy with the black, and if they had decided to keep it, I wouldn't have had any issues. In terms of the design itself, I think it's better than last year's, but definitely not as good as the 2020 and 2019 cars. The colour of the silver is just a little too dull, I guess that's the word I'd probably use, and so it looks a bit more grey than silver. But there are a number of details I do like. That long swooping shape on the lower part of the car, given that now the regulations have cleared up that barge board area, really works well as a long continuous flowing shape. The Mercedes stars on the engine cover are definitely better than all those AMG logos, and maybe they could have done with a bit more of a gradient towards the back. You know how in previous years they've had that black towards the back of the car. The AMG logos on the wheel covers are a nice touch as well. It's nice to see some of the teams doing something there. I definitely think a cool design or logo works much better on those than just a single plain colour. So overall, I think it's an alright livery, but had the potential to be so much better, and I think the fact that Mercedes themselves released the much better looking versions makes it a bit more disappointing than if it were fan-made or something. And so the actual design and car ends up being more towards the plainer, duller side, but in general, I personally really like the Mercedes style, and so it's 7th. In 6th place, I'm putting the Williams. Now, at first, I just sort of thought it wasn't much, like not bad, but just sort of there. But it has been growing on me. However, I do think it sort of lacks a little bit of flair or wow maybe that you'd look for on an F1 car. I like the use of the various blues at the back, because if they had kept that dark blue throughout the whole car, it would have just been too bland. And that pattern at the back does do well in covering the car with something that draws your eye, as they don't have many sponsors to fill spaces. It kind of looks like the Williams W as well, but not quite. Not sure if that's intentional or not, but either way, I think it's a good part of the design. Another thing I do really like on this car is the view from the front. I think that's probably its best angle, with that V and the lighter blue and the red looks good, with the little red accents on the side pod, and I think they work well with that. I'm not really convinced by the reasoning for the red, as apparently it's because it's British, at least that's what they've said. Now, there are definitely some video game vibes from the whole car, but nowhere near last year, and I think it's definitely an improvement from last year's car, though in all honesty I didn't actually hate the previous one too much. Overall, my liking of the Williams has sort of gone up and down since launch. While we only had renders, it grew on me, but then seeing it on track I wasn't as convinced. To me it didn't look quite as good, and I think it's because while it has the different blues, they're less noticeable when you see it from angles that aren't the same as the renders, and so it looks a little bit more just like a navy car, and it doesn't look quite as good like that. But yeah, overall it's good, definitely a simpler, maybe more classy style compared to others. Does lack a little bit of wow, so 6th is where I've put it. Again, it's not low because I think it's bad, but mainly because the others above it are good. So in 5th place, we then have what I'd sort of call the anti-Williams, where they were more simple and classy. This is just kind of the opposite, and that's the McLaren with their new brand and style. Now, the design has actually been implemented across all of their racing categories, so that's Formula 1, IndyCar and Extreme E, plus McLaren Shadow, but that livery is slightly different. And in all honesty, this was the one I was probably the most indecisive about. At times I'd hate it, at other times I think it was great, top 2 or 3, and then sometimes I just didn't really know how to feel about it. And while eventually I figured that I do think it's good, like it's a solid concept and a lot of people do really like it, and don't get me wrong, I do like it, but just not to the level of some of the cars above. The way I would sort of sum it up is they've nailed the style that they're going for, but that style is fairly polarising. Like people tend to really like it or really hate it, and so a 5th place feels about right for me. I definitely like the lighter blue, I think that works, as does the black with the orange, so the overall colour scheme is good. Just a little bit blocky, I guess is maybe the word I'm looking for. With the different colour blocks that is, and probably the matte finish doesn't really help with that. Plus the airbox kind of needs something there like a sponsor or logo, just compared to the rest of the car, it's a little bit plain. What I will say though is, while I've put it in the middle, I could definitely see it growing on me throughout the season, sort of as we get a bit more used to its very bold style. And one thing I'm definitely certain of is that it looks better when it's not just a plain white background, as whenever it's on track or in studios, the surroundings sort of rein the boldness back down to a slightly more normal level. Like the style and the cover doesn't overwhelm quite as much as when it's a plain background. So yeah, 5th for McLaren, it's pretty good, it's a cool design, just I don't always love it and so can't quite justify having it higher. In 4th place is the Ferrari. Now, a lot of people would probably have had this one in their top 2 maybe, and I won't lie, when I first saw it, I thought I'd have it up in that top spot, but every time I go back and look at it again, I think I like it slightly less. Personally, I prefer the normal Ferrari red, but overall I would say this design is almost kind of stealthy, maybe that's the word I would use to describe the livery as a whole. I think the black on the front and rear wings is nice, I do rate that, but there's a couple of other things I'm not too keen on which just hold it back a little, such as the way they've put the Ferrari 75 logo on the airbox, just that doesn't quite look right. You know, the car has a solid red and then a solid black, but this bit is just a slight gradient and looks a bit too much like a smudge, and so I'd say the black there isn't quite necessary, it sort of interrupts the red a bit too much. The other thing is the numbers. I don't think the black font works amazingly well on the shade of red, plus they're just a bit too cramped, especially Sainz's 55, like those numbers look really squished together there. Overall though, I think there is a lot to like. The red and the black as a combination are really nice. Again, not 100% keen on the particular red, but the black wings help the design for sure. They've done a good job as well, not making it look too crowded. You know, Ferrari have a good number of sponsors, and when you do have more, it's sometimes quite easy for them to just be a little bit too much. So definitely better than last year, but I don't think it's quite as good for me as it is for a lot of other people, but 4th place is where I've got it. In 3rd place, I have Red Bull, or as we've now found out, Oracle Red Bull Racing, who've stepped up and taken the title sponsor role. With the overall livery itself, it does obviously scream Red Bull and matches everything they've been building for years, and actually for me, one of the things I always think that shows a team's sort of stability is the livery. Like as teams get more and more set with their brand and their performance, the livery kind of stays consistent. You know, you can sort of look at Williams as an example on the other side of that, a team who've really changed their design over the past few years and haven't been the most stable of teams. With the design itself, it's the same concept as the past 15 years or so, and there's a reason for that. I know a lot of people will say it's boring, but it's a really good livery and concept as a whole. Just because they haven't changed it doesn't mean it's now bad. There are a couple of things that do stand out for me this year. Obviously, there's now the very big Oracle on the side pod, only costing a few $100 million to put it there. And while I think it does fit the design as a whole, I don't think it works quite as well as having the Red Bull logo as they have in previous years. The other little thing, which is very much nitpicking, is the small Red Bull logo in place of what was the Honda on the side pod. To me, it doesn't look quite as good just because of the white of the Honda broke up the red stripe really nicely, whereas now the little Red Bull logo kind of makes it look like the red line's just gone a bit weird for a small section. But as I mentioned, all these things are very small critiques, and I think it's really easy when a design is similar to previous years to forget that it is still a very good design. The way the red and the yellow pops from the blue just works. I'm not surprised it does, after all Red Bull are a huge brand and have their logos and colours all sorted out, so there's no surprises with that. So yeah, it's still a really good livery, still worthy of the top few places in my book. Then in 2nd is the Alfa Romeo. Now, when I first saw it, I was debating it with the AlphaTauri down towards the 7th or 8th spot, but even in the short time I've seen it, I've liked it more and more. The only worry I do have with moving it this high is that we haven't seen much of it on track, as currently at the time of recording this they've only released the renders / pretty images as well as some images from a filming day. So it's possible that once we see it on track a bit more it doesn't quite look as good, but nothing can really be done about that at the moment. Now, in terms of the design, there are a lot of aspects I do like. The 3 base colours of red, black and white are proportioned well, it feels very Alfa Romeo. Then the more I look around the car, the more there is that works, all these little details. The blackened front on the rear wings as well as the floor looks really good, it's just the right amount to make them interesting while keeping with the design. I know that probably sounds a little bit waffly, but hopefully you get what I mean. Something else on the car that I really love is the way they put the Italian flag on the rear wing. Like, it's enough colour to be seen well, but still reasonably subtle and fitting with the entire design. You know, it can't be seen from above the car, and so it's only that one view from behind where you can see it, and it just adds to that subtleness, and overall I think that's a good thing. The wheel covers as well look great. I know they're only a very small part of the design, but they've actually done something very interesting with them and it works. My only slight concerns are that the nose does look a little bit crowded, lots of sponsors on there, and the other thing is the angle between the red and the white on the side of the car. At first I was fairly unsure, it did make me think of it as a bit of a knockoff Marlboro McLaren, but the more I see it, the more I think it's not that bad. It's definitely not the best bit of the car, but it's also not terrible. So yeah, I'm liking the car more and more as I have time to look at it. Maybe that's just due to the pictures released, but I can't imagine on track it's going to be horrendously worse enough to knock it significantly. And obviously that means in first place is the Aston Martin, the AMR 22, and I think it's really, really good. They've brightened the green a little from last year, and I think it does look a better shade. It also makes sense as they wanted the car to stand out more, as last year Lawrence Stroll said it was a bit tricky to see on track, which I'd agree with. It didn't pop from the tarmac, and when I did see it, I kept thinking it was the Mercedes. Full disclaimer though, I am a little bit colourblind, so distinguishing colours is not my strong suit. So yeah, that as a base I like, and then the lime green kind of yellow accents definitely look better than the pink they had, with that idea being more distinctive and standing out a bit more. On the flip side, the main complaint I do have is it does seem a little crowded. Like the team have a lot of sponsors, you know, they've even got 2 title ones now with Aramco joining Cognizant, but I think it's the combination of the number of sponsors and the fact that the white and the lime colours really pop. That means every logo is really noticeable, which to be fair from the team's perspective is good. The other thing as well, which sort of annoys me a little bit, is on the back of the rear wing, where they've got an Aramco logo, and it's like they've covered that section with the Aramco colours, which I get. I understand, they're a big sponsor, it makes sense. But when I see it, I can't help but think it looks like they've just taken one of the sponsor boards you see at the side of the track and sort of stuck that on the rear wing. But overall, it's definitely stunning. It's changed a bit from last year, but definitely for the better. And as the team kind of start to dial in on a more consistent style, it still shouts Aston Martin, and overall I would say it's the livery that makes me go wow the most, which ultimately from an F1 car is kind of what I want and what I'm looking for. So that rounds out my livery rankings. I wish I could say I was fully confident in where I've put them all, but given this year's crop of designs are generally of a very high standard across pretty much all the teams, it's been really difficult to settle on a more definitive order for them. And other than the Haas and maybe the Alpine, I'd say they're all good liveries. Anyways, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know your thoughts along with any feedback and suggestions down in the comments. And if you'd enjoyed, make sure to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more F1 content. It really helps the channel out, and after all, we are getting fairly close to the start of the season. So thanks again, and until next time, take care.